Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Gary Taubes, who is an independent investigative health science journalist and also the author of many books. The most recent book is called Rethinking Diabetes, What Science Reveals About Diet, Insulin, and Successful Treatments, which follows up on a bunch of other books, 4 other books, in fact, about diet and health, including Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. And this one from, I guess, is this maybe 2007 or so? Good Calories, Bad Calories, Challenging the Conventional Wisdom on Diet, Weight Control, and Disease. And there were 2 others, In Defense of Keto and, I guess, An Attack on Sugar. Is that the one? I can't remember the name.
Case Against Sugar.
Yeah, the Case Against Sugar.
Actually, the case for keto and the case against sugar. My publishers liked the Case Against Sugar did so well. They thought, let's echo that title.
Right. And then there were these 2 earlier books, Bad Science and Nobel Dreams. And I think there's a theme among all of them, both the diet books and the pre-diet books, which is sort of investigating the evolution of science and the conventional wisdom in science, and how ideas can develop which may not be necessarily valid, and how they tend to become sticky, right? So I think of this latest book, I mean, all of the books have a lot of history in them. You know, you go through and look at how thinking around a particular topic changes over time. And it's never like there is only one strand of research. There's often multiple strands of research. And I was very fascinated by this idea that there were research agendas around diet going back to the 1700s, which we've later kind of resurrected, right? Yeah. And we found that the conventional wisdom back then might be closer to being valid than the conventional wisdom that we have right now. And I guess one question I'll probably ultimately ask you is why it takes a journalist to be setting medical science in the right direction, and why there seems to be a problem with the sort of self-correction mechanisms in medical science that we would expect to kick in. So maybe we can get started by asking you why you decided to drill down into diabetes specifically, because I think your work has also explored the impact of this conventional wisdom on other, what we might think of as diseases of civilization, like heart disease and so forth. And I think probably your motivation had to do with the fact that diabetes is incredibly pervasive disease. It's expanding and growing in the US, and also probably at a higher rate in the developing world as they adopt Western dietary habits. And I think if we were to look back on the COVID crisis, it probably would have been better described as a metabolic disease crisis, because I think that the impact of COVID was really, at least in the US, one that disproportionately affected people with metabolic diseases, and that made us particularly vulnerable to this new virus. So tell me, why did you decide? And this really is, I think, in many ways, a magnum opus, probably the history. I know there's another history of diabetes that you referenced in the book, which was itself comprehensive, but this digs deeper, I think, into a lot of the issues around the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, this is the first sort of history of diabetes therapy and thinking. So let me backtrack, because if I was one of your listeners, the first thing that I would be asking is, why am I paying attention to a journalist, as you noted, who's writing about medical science, let alone one whose books have titles like The Case for Keto and, you know, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, which sound very suspiciously like lay diet books.
Well, and you don't have it. You don't have a diet, the Taubes diet, right? You aren't pushing
and
pills.
I don't have a diet, and the worst,
no green pills.
Yeah, I don't have a medical degree. Actually, this latest book was the first book I was very nervous about writing, because without a medical degree and without being a patient, they were 2 vitally important contexts on one level. So let me just take a minute to give you my background. So why a journalist? Because if you don't accept that, then everything we go from here is meaningless. So I had a hard science degree, physics and engineering from Stanford, and I went to journalism school. I wanted to be an investigative journalist. I ended up getting a job in science writing because I had a science background that allowed me to stay in New York. My first book, Nobel Dreams, which you mentioned, I had an opportunity to go to the big physics lab outside Geneva, CERN, and what we would now say I was embed myself with these physicists who had claimed to have discovered the greatest breakthrough in physics in 40 years. And the line I had heard from the PI of this collaboration, who everyone knew was going to win the Nobel Prize for earlier work, which he did while I was there, was that all they had to do was turn on their experiment, get a little more data, narrow it down, and Nobel Prize number 2. And as soon as I got there, despite being a journalist, it was pretty clear there was something wrong with the research. A significant
Well, wait, is that in spite of being a journalist? Is that in spite of being a journalist, or is that perhaps because
well, I mean, I studied physics in college, but I got a C- in quantum physics, and my advisor suggested I find another career path, which I did. It shouldn't be so obvious so quickly that there were problems with the research and the publications. As it turned out, this is a collaboration of 150 physicists, which was huge back then and is small today. And of the 150, a significant portion had actually built the equipment themselves. They were sort of mid-level physicists from red brick colleges in the UK and the universities scattered around Europe, and the ones who had built the equipment were very skeptical that it could actually do what the collaboration director and his group of young hotshot analysts believed it could do. And I ended up, over the course of 9 months, watching them realize how they had screwed up, how they had misinterpreted their background analysis, or in reality hadn't put enough effort into it. And in the process, it turned out that the head of this collaboration, someone named Carlo Rubbia, was pretty much soundly disliked throughout the physics community because he had done this kind of bad science before. So I could travel around the country and around Europe and interview very prestigious physicists, brilliant experimentalists who were delighted to be able to explain to me how he had screwed up his earlier work. And it was a learning experience in the nuts and bolts of science. One of the epigraphs in the book was from Leon Lederman, a Nobel laureate who was running the Fermi National Laboratory outside of Chicago. And Leon told me he'd like to walk around the lab and talk to the graduate students because they hadn't learned how to lie yet. And this was kind of the education I was getting. If you wanted to know what's really going on in science, you don't talk to the head of the last author, and you don't necessarily, you talk to the last author, you talk to the first author, but it's all the people in the middle who did the hard work, who built the apparatus, who took the data, who are the ones who really know how they could have screwed up. My second book was about cold fusion. Bad science this was a great scientific fiasco of the 20th century. After I had written one book on controversial science, people would come to me with other offers, write about this. I interviewed 300 or so researchers, administrators, postdocs, graduate students, janitors, if I could find them, to understand what had happened, why this so clearly incorrect result, bogus phenomena, had been front page in the Wall Street Journal and then major news for 3 months. Again, some of the best experimental scientists in the world ended up, in effect, mentoring me in how difficult it is to get the right answer and how easy it is to get the wrong answer. And by the time I was done with that, I had a lot of fans in the physics community, saw me as a sort of loaded gun. They could point at whatever bothered them in science and pull the trigger. And they said to me, if you're interested in bad science, you should look at some of the stuff in public health that's terrible. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about a particular observation, an association between electromagnetic fields and higher rates of brain cancer and leukemia that had been the subject of 2 major New Yorker articles and books, and was getting power companies sued for cancers, and it was all based on the science of epidemiology, which is at the heart of much of our nutrition discussions. And I was stunned at how bad the science was. I had spent a decade being mentored in all the ways in which all the rigor and meticulous nature of your approach to the experiments and the apparatus, and to understanding the apparatus and making sure that when the damn thing is set to zero, there's no effect. You know what you're seeing, and you know it's not your apparatus trying to fuel you. And here I got to the epidemiology community, and they treated all this rigor as sort of a luxury they couldn't afford. It's just too hard to do. So they assumed they didn't need it. And that
Well, to be
led,
fair, I mean,
within
longitudinal studies around dietary interventions, I mean, they do take a long time, especially if you're measuring things like mortality, right?
Well, it's not just that they take a long time. There's a reason why you randomize people or objects or participants in any kind of controlled trial. And that randomization is to do the best job you can of making sure that the baseline, the context of the two groups that you're comparing is the same. And as soon as you take a subject in nutritional epidemiology, like one I end up writing about a lot, is red and processed meat bad for you? So ultimately what you're doing is you're looking at a group of say 100,000 nurses in the nurses' health study, and you're looking at those that eat red meat and those that don't, and you're comparing them, or the first and the fifth quintile of meat consumption. And your baseline assumption is that the only thing different between these people is the meat consumption. And I once had a friend of mine joke, this was actually before I moved out here to Oakland. He said, it's like comparing, Berkeley residents who go to eat dinner at Chez Panisse after their yoga class to redneck truck drivers from West Virginia who are eating at Denny's. And then when you see health disparate differences between them, you assume it's because of the meat content of their meals, instead of the fact that basically how much meat you eat or don't eat is kind of a marker of a whole world of health conscious behaviors that you cannot control for. The only way to do it would be to randomize the group of people to begin with and say you eat meat and you don't, and then see what happens. Then you've got a controlled trial, or the beginnings of a controlled trial, but you cannot control for them. And I think the epidemiologists, well, they used to realize this. And the longer they've gone along, they've realized there's sort of nothing they can do about the fact that they cannot trust their results. And so they're just going to pretend that they can and continue to have viable careers. And that probably sounds brutally cynical, but I've been writing about these people now for 35 years, and they have never demonstrated to me that they care to truly understand these confounders in their experiments. So anyway,
well, I mean,
fruits of... Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, you do talk about in the book about how we have begun to do quite a bit more randomized control trials, right, in the public health arena, particularly in the area related to nutrition. But I think one of the points you make is that even as new evidence comes in, people are very reluctant to abandon their prior opinions or their prior beliefs. And you argue that what comes first oftentimes determines what the outcome is, even decades later. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how this whole food literature that you've created got started. I remember when the New York Times Magazine article came out that you wrote, whenever that was, I forget, but I remember reading it and being very affected by it, and really made me a lot more curious about this whole low-fat dogma, which seemed to be pervasive, and I think it's still to this day pervasive. I mean, I was just at the doctor not too long ago, and after I got my results back on the blood test, they said, "Oh, you must eat a very low-fat diet." It's like, well, I don't know where you're getting that from, but how did you first become aware of the faulty science in this domain?
Okay, well, I mean, it's serendipity. I was I was living in Los Angeles, freelancing for Science. I was a correspondent for Science, which is a glorified freelancer. So I needed a story to pay my rent that month. And I called or emailed my editor. I don't know what we did back in 1998. It might have been email. And said, do you have a story I could turn over quickly to pay my lunch? And there was an article pay my rent. And there was an article coming out in the New England Journal of Medicine on what's called the DASH diet, dietary approaches to stop hypertension. This is still considered one of the 2 or 3 healthiest diets in the world, if you consider people like U.S. News and World Report know what they're doing. So DASH was coming out in the New England Journal of Medicine. It had been leaked to Science. I didn't know this. And it had been leaked to Science with a list of people to interview. And the way you normally do these stories as a journalist, science journalist, is you call up the PI who did the study, and they're aware that you're going to write about it, and they give you an interview, and you ask them for a few people who would know enough about the research, even though it's published, to comment. And if you get 3 interviews, you could write a page, which is 1,000 words, and I could pay my rent, and the whole thing takes 2 days. In this case, they send me the story. I call the PI. He tells me someone to interview, and then I interview the first name on the list of the names that had been given us by the person who leaked us a story, and that person's a former president of the American Heart Association. And she tells me she can't talk about the story because she'll lose her funding. And I say this is, we're not living in the Lysenko era Soviet Union. People don't lose their funding for talking about a diet study in the New England Journal of Medicine, and she refused to talk to me. I said, look, let's just go off the record, not for attribution. Just if you don't tell me what's wrong with this study, I will have no idea, and then I will commit whatever sin. And she refused, even off the record, to talk to me about the study. So then I called the first name on the list of given to me by the PI, and he started yelling at me that there was no controversy over salt and high blood pressure. And I kept saying, well, Professor, I'm not calling about salt and high blood pressure. I'm calling about this diet study, DASH, in the New England Journal of Medicine. And he said, that's great because there is no controversy over salt and high blood pressure. And I got off the phone and I called up my editor of Science. I said, I got one former president of the AHA refusing to talk to me, says she'll lose her funding if she does. And I have another professor at Northwestern screaming at me that there's no controversy over salt and high blood pressure when I wasn't calling about that. There must be a controversy over salt and high blood pressure that we know nothing about. And as it turns out, the DASH diet was a way of lowering blood pressure as much as any medications, and more so than salt restriction, and it didn't include salt restriction. So the person who leaked it to Science did so because this was evidence against the salt hypothesis, and it turned out there was this enormous controversy. And so I spent 9 months, I did the story on DASH so I could pay my rent, and then I spent 9 months working on the salt and hypertension story. I interviewed 85, 90 people for one magazine article. I at one point printed out a stack of papers about a foot high that were all the key articles in the field, and I had found 3 very good biostatisticians I trusted who had never written about salt and blood pressure to, in effect, referee these papers for me for free. It turned out the science was terrible. It was an interesting hypothesis that sodium causes hypertension and high blood pressure, the salt content of the diet, but they had numerous clinical trials had failed to demonstrate it, and the epidemiologic surveys that said it was true were so confounded by other factors that only a true believer would find that evidence compelling. So I wrote that article. It was called the political science of fat. And while I was doing that research, same professor from Northwestern, I had done a lengthy series of interviews with him, and he was clearly one of the worst scientists I had ever interviewed in my life. And after writing a book called Bad Science, and my first book, Nobel Dreams, I thought as a journalist I had a pretty good take what a bad scientist sounds like. It's just when you're discussing data and evidence with people, you can tell by the way they describe the strength of the evidence. So somebody, for instance, who tells you there's no evidence for something is usually a pretty bad scientist, because there's always some evidence for something. I mean, there's evidence that diabetes is caused by Martians. It's not good evidence, but it's there. I mean, if you wanted to find it. So it's sort of, anyway, this guy, worst scientists, one of the 5 worst I interviewed, and I thought I had interviewed some of the worst scientists in the world, took credit not just for getting Americans on the low salt diet that we had been eating through the 90s, but also on the low fat diet. And again, I got off the phone with him. I called up my editor. I said, when I'm done writing about salt, I'm going to write about fat. I have no idea what the story is, but if this guy's involved in any substantive way, I can guarantee there's a story there. Because the message of my first decade of research is that bad scientists never get the wrong answer. Excuse me, bad scientists never get the right answer. Nature isn't kind enough. So
what I was surprised. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead and finish.
I was just going to say, so I spent a year on a investigation for science on the fat story, and then when I interviewed 160 odd researchers and administrators who had helped, and congressional representatives and congressmen. I interviewed McGovern because he had played a critical role in the low fat, communicating the low fat dogma. And by that time, I knew that I had a very good feeling of how bad nutrition science is and how it might have affected everything else we believed. And I wanted to write a book, but I knew that if I was going to spend a year on a magazine article, I was going to spend 3, 4, 5 years on a book, and I wasn't going to get enough funding to do that. And by that time, I was getting married and hoping to have children, and getting funding for my work seemed important. And then I wrote this infamous New York Times Magazine cover story you mentioned, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? And that was so controversial that it got me a large book advance, and then I could settle down and do good calories, bad calories. And I mean, an important fact is I went into this with no preconceptions, other than I thought I understood what good science looks like and what bad science looks like. That I think I know as well as anyone, or have studied at least as much as anyone. But I had been following the conventional wisdom. I had been eating a low-fat, low-salt diet. I had assumed that weight control was all about how much you eat and exercise. Never thought differently. And then doing this research in the early 2000s, and I spent 5 years on good calories, bad calories. The internet by that time had made virtually all of the literature available. So, in say 4 years of research, I was able to do more than any human being had ever done in the past. You'd have had to live in a medical school library with your stacks of quarters and your Xerox machine and your notepads and maybe your laptop, and for decades to do what by 2001 could be done in 4 years. And now, of course, you could do the whole thing in 3 months and translate it into any language you want in the process. But
well, in all of the books, I kept expecting a political economy story, right? So when I put my political economy hat on and I'm trying to understand the food pyramid, I'm trying to understand the low-fat dogma, my inclination is to think, well, it's got to be because of lobbyists from Iowa, right? Trying to get people to consume more high fructose corn syrup. It's got to be that these scientists are bought and paid for by the insulin industry or something like this. But your narrative is really one of intellectual history. I think it's all about the evolution of the ideas. Was that a conscious choice, or do you really believe that the kind of wrong turns that have been made were ones that were made by researchers who just fell into intellectual traps?
I do. I have friends, allies who think I'm naive to not follow the money, which is what journalists are taught to do. you could see the intellectual traps, though, in the history long before the money got involved. So the sugar book, I discuss the influence of the sugar industry, which is pretty profound, but I still believe the scientists could have gotten the right answer. And I mean, you actually see this in modern nutrition. So when between the mid 1955 and then 1985, when this low fat dogma was first voiced as a hypothesis and then tested in clinical trials, which failed to confirm it, but then accepted as a truth based on drug studies, and a very ambiguous drug study at that. That would have happened independent of any financial influence, as far as I could tell. So but again, I mean, your podcast is called Unsiloed. My interest was good science and bad science. Mm-hmm. So had I come along, I write a Substack now with the journalist Nina Teicholz, and Nina's interests are, well, good science and bad science, but also industry, corruption and conflicts of interest. She covered the same area, but from a different perspective, in which you get much more the industry involvement. Mm-hmm. But my interest is these cognitive traps, what it is, what you have to do to get science right, and what the way I think about it. So for diabetes, and again now, because imagine a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle that gives you, when it's complete, everything, all the major important facts about mechanisms of the disease and treatment of the disease and prevention of the disease and how they're all interlocked. And when you go back into history, you see people making decisions based on 20 or 30 pieces that they have available at the time. And if they're influential and they write textbooks, which was the case in diabetes, and those decisions will be embraced by others as facts. And then as more and more pieces of the puzzle become available, instead of asking themselves, how should we change the way we think, or do we need to change the way we think radically based on this? And do we need to change our therapeutic philosophies radically based on this? The thinking that is usually, well, how can we make this finding reconcile with what we already believe? And by now we believe it to be true. We've even forgotten that it's a hypothesis. So it's very easy to fill a vacuum in science, but once you've got that vacuum filled, it's very difficult to replace what's there with something new. And the history of science is full of these, lines. Science progresses funeral by funeral because nobody changes their mind. And each piece of evidence that comes in is, like I said, you try to reconcile it with what you believe. There's never enough evidence at any point in time to say, did we screw this whole thing up entirely? And this can easily be true in fields in which it's difficult to test the hypotheses. So in a hard science where you can do the experiment, you get a hypothesis, it makes predictions, you do an experiment to test the predictions. If you think you've confirmed your hypothesis, you publish it, but now you have to give your recipe for the experiment so that other people can independently replicate it. And there's nothing worse than being embarrassed by your peers. Mm-hmm. And, good scientists live to be able to embarrass their peers and their mentors by showing that they coming up with an experiment that demonstrates that they were wrong. But in fields like nutrition and public health, you can't test your experiments. You can't test your hypotheses. It's too difficult to do. I mean, you could do it, but it's these lengthy, exorbitantly expensive, impractical clinical trials. And it's easy to, one of the lessons when you do an experiment is, so I co-ran a not-for-profit for 6 years, funding research that I thought could resolve some of the issues raised in my books. And one of the lessons that I should have known is that when you do an experiment, you learn how you screwed up if you're a good scientist. because by definition, you're always doing something no one's ever done before, because it's boring to do stuff that people have done before. So you're always doing something new. You're always working at the limits of what your apparatus or your observational equipment can do. And 99 times out of 100, you're going to screw up that first time out. And then you're going to learn how you screw up, and you're going to fix it, and you sort of iterate your way towards what you hope is truth. But if each experiment costs 10 or $20 million and takes 5 years, you can't do that. And so this sort of process, go ahead.
Yeah, I know you finish your thought.
Yeah, the process of hypothesis and test breaks down, and then you get people accepting the hypotheses based on consistent observations or Bradford Hill criteria, which have never been checked, or, pick your poison, which is all their way of saying we can't rigorously test this, so we're going to believe the hypothesis.
Well, part of your story also is about the interplay between medical science and medical practice. So, there are some sciences that are less applied, but medical science has this applied side. And so, we're putting this stuff into practice in a way that has an immediate effect. And maybe we could go back in time, because diabetes has been with us for a long time. We've had the skinny version and the fat version, to use the old terminology. And the fat version is the one that's been growing like crazy. But there were people as early as the 1700s that understood that you could do something called nutritional therapy, right? That you could help these people with diabetes to live longer and perhaps healthier by adjusting their diet away from sugars and towards fats. And so that seemed to be something like a conventional wisdom for a while. So how do we move away from that?
And yeah, so this is diabetes was a very rare disease, which is hard to imagine in a world where 1 in 9 or 10 Americans now suffers from diabetes. And you could go to the local drugstore and there's an aisle dedicated just to diabetes treatment paraphernalia. The 1797, a British physician named Rollo, working for the military, sees his second case of diabetes in his career, and it's a Colonel Meredith who's lost a lot of weight recently. He's got all the sort of classic symptoms of uncontrolled diabetes. He's hungry all the time, he's thirsty all the time, he's peeing constantly, he's weak. Back in 1790, well, through the 19th century, a classic diagnostic technique was to taste the urine, or ideally have your assistant taste the urine, and the urine was sweet, so you get a diabetes diagnosis. And Rollo thinks to himself, well, if the urine's sweet, then there's sweets, which are carbohydrates that the body isn't metabolizing. They're in the urine. So what happens if I have him eat a carbohydrate-free diet? And he recommends what he calls the animal diet. And it's fatty and rancid meat and blood sausages. And I think he allows him a piece of toast every day and some green vegetables. And
I couldn't figure out why it had to be rancid.
Well, Rollo doesn't actually say, and by his second patient, he dropped the rancid meat requirement. The point is, Meredith got better. Meredith actually ends up, at the stage she was diagnosed, probably had months to a year to live. He ends up living for another 12 years. Rollo tries this again on his second patient. He sees another patient, a general, who gets better, but then decides to go off the diet. As one of the common phenomena back then is you'd go on the diet and you'd think, oh, I'm cured. So then you go off it. And then the symptoms would come back and you'd go back on the diet and think, oh, now I'm cured, and go off. And the doctors thought of this as a potential cure. So once the patient was in remission, they would allow him to go back to eating the foods that had brought them into remission, or abstaining had brought them into remission. Anyway, Rollo treats the general, who also does well, but then falls off the diet and dies. And Rollo writes a pamphlet. This is 1797. He distributes it throughout the United Kingdom, to basically saying, look, I think I have a cure for diabetes here, a very successful therapy. Try it on your own patients. and write back to me and let me know how it works. And this was the way successful medical therapy would disseminate through the medical community prior to randomized controlled trials. And few dozen physicians write back, and for the most part, this animal diet seems to work on the disease. And by the mid 19th century, all the major, mid to late 19th century, all the major diabetes specialists and medical centers in the US and Europe are using variations on the animal diet. And that it's standard of what we would call standard of care. It was, in effect, the only effective therapy for the disorder. And towards the end of the 19th century, they were adding improving it by adding fat to the diet. So the idea was you wouldn't see patients whether they had the fat or skinny kind of diabetes, so type 2 or type 1, we'd say today. They wouldn't show up to the doctor's office until they had lost a lot of weight and were weak and emaciated. And so the doctors wanted to put as much calories on them as possible, as much weight back on them as possible. So they wanted to feed them as much as possible. And they knew they couldn't give them carbohydrates because by then they were thinking of the disorder of carbohydrate tolerance, but they could give them fat. And they'd thrive on fat, or at least type 2 diabetics would. So the diets got higher and higher in fat. The leading authorities are writing about the importance of butter and heavy cream and feeding diabetics. The more you could embrace fat in the diet, the healthier you could be. And the leading diabetes expert in the US, Elliot Joslin, who opened the first dedicated diabetes clinic in the US in Boston, it became the Joslin Diabetes Center, which is the world leader today. Joslin talked about the key to making patients healthy was getting them to eat fat. And his mother, who had diabetes, the reason he was so obsessed is diabetes ran in his family. His mother had it, his aunt had it. His mother outlived any of her peers, basically eating this fat-rich animal diet with a pretty profound diabetes diagnosis in her 50s, I guess. So that's a standard of care. And then insulin is discovered. Well, there's a brief 7-year period where a Harvard doctor starts pushing a semi-starvation diet for diabetes.
Right. So less food does mean less carbohydrates, but it does mean also...
It does mean less carbohydrates, but it also means less fat.
Yeah.
And type 1 patients, often children on the brink of death, could seemingly do better on the semi-starvation diet than they could on the high-fat diet that the type 2s thrived on. So physicians, most prominently Joslin, embraced the semi-starvation, particularly for children and adolescents. And the result were these kids who looked like, European physicians would come to the U.S. and comment about how they could torture these children the way they did. And then, later, 50 years later, they would say when they saw photos of the concentration camp survivors from Nazi Germany, they reminded them of their patients in the late teens and early 20s. But if this semi-starvation...
You would think that the discovery of insulin and hormones, right, which was really quite revolutionary, that this would lead to a better understanding of this mechanism, right, and would lead to...
Yeah, and instead, what's interesting, it leads, I don't know if you could say, it leads from very poor understanding to the wrong understanding in 95% of cases. So one of the great moments in diabetes is 1889, when this German Minkowski and his colleagues realized that if they remove the pancreas from a dog, the dog becomes diabetic. So the pancreas, at least in some cases, Minkowski was a good scientist. He didn't say diabetes is a disorder of pancreatic deficiency. He said in some cases it might be a disorder of pancreatic deficiency. And then in 1921, these researchers at the University of Toronto, Banting and Best and their colleagues, very famous moment in diabetes history, like the most famous, isolate insulin from pancreases and inject it into rabbits and show that it lowers blood sugar. And then finally in January 1922, they get a human patient, a 13-year-old kid near death named Leonard Thompson, and this drug brings him back. And it's a miracle drug. So you can give this drug to a diabetic patient who's in a diabetic ketoacidotic coma and is going to die, and you can bring them back from that coma. And the medical world has seen nothing like it. It's the first real miracle drug, this sort of paradigmatic miracle drug in medicine. And the problem is, as soon as you've got this idea that diabetes is a pancreatic deficiency disorder, you isolate insulin from the pancreas, seems to confirm the idea that it's a pancreatic deficiency disorder, and then you give patients back insulin and they seem to do well, and the type 1 patients are born again, almost literally. And it locks in this idea that diabetes is a disorder of insulin deficiency, and the pancreas is the primary organ involved. And that might be true for type 1 diabetes, which is a disorder of insulin deficiency and is maybe 5 to 10% of all cases. But it's completely wrong for type 2 diabetes. All these older, the fatty diabetics, the older, heavier diabetics like Jocelyn's mother, who go through long periods prior to manifesting weight loss when they're what's called insulin resistant. And because their tissues are resistant to the hormone insulin, and particularly their liver, their pancreas is pumping out too much insulin, not too little. But those patients are also being given insulin therapy because what you're measuring is, well, first it's sugar in the urine, and then it's sugar in the blood. And so you're trying to control blood sugar or urine sugar without any idea of whether you're giving insulin to someone who's got too little or insulin to somebody who's got too much. And it's not until the 1960s.
And that's because it's extremely difficult to measure insulin levels relative to measuring glucose levels, right? You can measure glucose levels,
and it's
relatively easily, right?
Yeah, and part of this book, again, and doing the research, was a learning experience and how much the assays you have available, the detection, the technology you have available to study the problem determines what you think. And in medicine, it determines therapy. So you can tell if there's sugar in the urine. You can actually measure blood sugar levels in the blood, but it requires a laboratory test. So you take a blood sample from a patient, you send it to a laboratory. 3 weeks later, you're told what their blood sugar was the day you took the hour you took the measurement. And that's the only information you get. The patients have no access to knowing what their blood sugar is, although they can check for sugar in the urine. The sugar in the urine doesn't reflect blood sugar levels. It reflects blood sugar levels like 6-8 hours before. So there's no way to tell what it actually is that's raising and lowering your blood sugar. You can't see how your blood sugar responds to different foods or different physical activities or stress or sleep. You can't see how your blood sugar, how your insulin levels can't be measured at all, because insulin is such a tiny hormone, tiny molecule compared to, say, cholesterol. So you can't measure insulin levels at all. That's why for 40 years, physicians assumed that patients with diabetes were insulin deficient because they couldn't measure it. In 1960, a couple of scientists, Burson and Yallo from, I always forget if it's Einstein or Mount Sinai in New York, no, the VA hospital in the Bronx, create a radioimmunoassay that allows them for the first time ever to measure insulin levels in the blood. And in their very first patient, they're measuring diabetics and obese patients, and they say, these people don't have low insulin, they have high insulin. And the implication should be, wait, we're giving insulin to patients who one of their problems is they have too much, not too little, and yet our therapy is to give them more. Let's rethink this. But it takes about a decade for the technology to spread through the medical community so that other laboratories can confirm what Yallo and Burson had seen. It takes about 20 years for thinking about the disorder to move, and meanwhile, you've got the physicians determining what therapy is, and you've got the American Diabetes Association coming along and giving guidelines. based on what used to be a complete absence of information. So as the technology improves and the science improves and your understanding of the disease improves, for like type 2, it's not just that it's not an insulin deficiency disorder and it's not a pancreatic disorder, it's an insulin excess order, insulin resistance, and the primary organ involved is the liver.
You
And
said
in
at one
both
point
these
that there was.
disease-
You said at one point there was some group of scientists that thought this might involve the liver, but that line of research kind of went underground for a while.
Well, they established that it was true. There was always, you can always find in the literature, the people discovering the competing hypotheses. So there's always an alternative hypothesis. It might not be one. As we talked about, it's the first hypothesis tends to have such an advantage over all those that follow that the others have to then try and replace that. And as more and more people buy into that first hypothesis and believe it, and they base their treatments on it, and they write papers and textbooks about it, they become more and more biased. I was just speaking to a nutritionist, 80-year-old tremendous nutritionist the other day, who used the phrase allegiance bias. So you develop an allegiance to what you believe, to the technologies you're using, to the therapies you're giving, to what your colleagues believe. And all of these reasons are why scientists are supposed to express hypotheses with such humility. You get an idea of what's working and what's not, and you voice it with incredible humility, because the worst thing that can happen is that it be wrong and be embraced. And it's the easiest thing to happen.
Yeah, I mean, here's
And
a case where it's not it's not where you are learning that there is a better way. It's you're learning that you are actually doing the complete opposite, right? I mean, is that perhaps
in
why?
this case you're arguably doing the, I mean, you need a competing hypothesis. You need a competing therapeutic hypothesis as well, which they didn't believe they had. They had forgotten by this point about the high-fat animal diet as a therapy for these diseases. So when insulin is discovered, this is how it affects medical practice. You have this incredibly powerful drug, extraordinarily powerful at lowering blood sugar. And it turns out that lowering blood sugar can be very quickly fatal. So high blood sugar is diabetes. That's fatal over a long period of time. It'll accelerate your demise. But low blood sugar can kill you overnight. Hypoglycemic episode. And now you have a drug that's capable of creating hypoglycemic episodes, which had never really been seen before. It was a new disorder. So how do you protect your patients from the cure for their disease? And the irony, again, if they had type 2 diabetes, they're insulin resistant. So if they have type 1, a little bit of insulin is all they need to help them control their blood sugar. It's a more extreme disease. You would think that they would need more of the hormone, but it's actually because they're just missing the hormone. A little bit will do the job. If you have type 2, you're insulin resistant. You've already got too much insulin. So you have to pump in a whole 100 or 200 units a day of insulin to actually have a difference on blood sugar. And in type 1s, you could create hypoglycemic shock. They called it insulin shock or insulin overdose because that's what it was. You gave the patient too much insulin. So the way you treat it is you get the patient to eat carbohydrates. So for 125 years prior to insulin, you're telling people to avoid carbohydrates because they have a carbohydrate intolerance disorder. As soon as insulin comes along, which is an appropriate therapy for 5 to 10% of your patients, inappropriate for 90%, you tell them, take the drug and we're now going to have you take carbohydrates, eat regularly at breakfast, at snacks, at lunch, at meals to cover the insulin while the insulin's covering the carbs. And with children, and type 1 is a disorder back then primarily of children and adolescents, it was a horrible disorder. And I mean, a patient given a diagnosis of type 1 pre-insulin was a death sentence. So you didn't want to tell the parents or the child, look, you've got this terrible disease and you can never eat an ice cream cone again because that's going to make it worse. So the idea that they could just let these kids eat like their families did, let them eat like their friends did. The parents don't have to cook different meals for their different children. Everyone eats the same thing, seemed perfectly natural. The doctors came to assume the kids are going to eat like that anyway, so let's just give them more and more insulin. And the carbohydrate, they referred to it as sort of liberal carbohydrate diets. Let's just let them eat whatever they want. And there's a Swedish physician who wrote that if you've ever seen a child with diabetes, the exhilaration of eating an ice cream cone at a birthday party makes it all worthwhile.
But I think you talk about how
they did.
You talk about how initially a lot of these medical practitioners, they sort of gave up on the idea that patients would ever adhere to any kind of restrictive diet. And so they said, well, we've got this wonder drug. If we try to give them dietary advice, they're probably not going to take it. But that's very different from actually encouraging them, right, to ingest carbohydrates. And I think you talk about how this entirely parallel area of research, which was related to heart health and the dietary recommendations there, then sort of got imported into the advice that were given to diabetics. So diabetics were actually told to have a low-fat diet and a high-carb diet.
Well, it actually, in doing this research, I didn't realize that the idea that we get heart disease from the fat content of our diet, and particularly saturated fat and LDL cholesterol, is how it evolved. But that was actually in the diabetes community before it percolated into the heart disease community. And the Russians and Europeans were entertaining it as a hypothesis in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And then that spread to the diabetes community. And as I said, when this fellow Elliot Jocelyn decided that a semi-starvation diet protected his young patients from diabetic ketoacidosis and coma, he assumed that it must be the dietary fat that's causing those diseases. And maybe the reason that diabetics tend to do poorly is because they've been telling them to eat so much fat. So in the diabetes community, Jocelyn, even after insulin, couldn't get it out of his head that dietary fat was the sort of primary danger in the diet, even though he knew that diabetes was a disorder of carbohydrate metabolism, and that patients with diabetes could metabolize fat without insulin. They could do fine on those pills. So he was conflicted, but his textbooks were constantly hammering on the dangers of fat. And then in the 1950s, when this researcher, Ansel Keys, nutritionist from the University of Minnesota, comes along and first voices this idea that dietary heart attacks in America, the high prevalence of heart disease, is caused by the high fat content of our diet. That's resisted as a kind of naive hypothesis by cardiologists, but Keys is a very energetic, forceful fellow, the kind of guy that you say, he doesn't suffer fools gladly. And then you define fools as, from his perspective, as anyone who disagrees with his interpretation. Keys did this famous 7-country study, and the medical community back then understood that they had to test their hypotheses, particularly nutritional hypotheses. So they did a series of clinical trials. And as I said, the clinical trials, for the most part, never confirmed the hypothesis. But by 1971, this idea that we should all eat, the American Heart Association had been kind of infiltrated by Keys and his colleagues. And even though Keys wasn't even a medical doctor, he had 2 PhDs, but they had spread this idea that dietary fat is the primary cause of heart disease. And the government was spending, by the 1970s, hundreds of millions of dollars testing the idea. And all of this seemed to communicate to people that it was assuredly the right idea. You just had to get a little more data and nail it down, to quote the physicist who first said that line to me when I went off to CERN in 1984. And it turns out when you get a little more data, you don't confirm the idea, but you don't reject the hypothesis because of it, because now you have to justify why you spend 10 or 20 years on the hypothesis. Again, a good scientist and a functioning scientist, there's nothing better than refuting your hypothesis. But when the government gets involved in these huge institutions, it's hard to accept that. So by 1971, this idea, the AHA, the American Heart Association, is pushing this idea that everyone over the age of 2 should eat low-fat diets, and the lower the fat, the better. And diabetologists had always been dealing with this high rate of heart disease in their patients. And so based on, again, one very forceful individual, a guy named Ed Bierman at the University of Washington, the ADA put out guidelines saying, we've been wrong all this time. The problem isn't the carbohydrates in the diet, it's the fat. I mean, that's not what the guidelines said. That was the implications. And we're going to put the whole country on every diabetic patient on a low-fat diet. And the actual guidelines, when you read the paper, and this is the longest block quote I have in the paper, because it's, seems to be true, but then this isn't true, and this could be true, but we've already refuted that. I mean, it's on the one hand this, on the one hand that, on the one hand this, on the one hand that. But we're going to tell every patient with diabetes to get more than 50% of their calories from the one macronutrient they can't metabolize without pharmaceutical help. And we think that that's going to lower their risk of heart disease, although we have no clinical trials to demonstrate that one way or the other. And we've been living with that ever since. The ADA, every 5 or so years, will revisit their nutritional guidelines. And finally, in 2019, they did it in a way where they were able to say, well, wait a minute, we really don't have any evidence for this, and this animal diet from the 19th century seems to be much better tested and much more efficient, but nothing really changes.
Well, we haven't talked about obesity. Obviously, it's related to diabetes. There's a strong correlation with type 2 diabetes and obesity. But do you think that this idea that this conventional belief that fat makes you fat, is it just because it kind of seems intuitive that if you find fat in the blood, let's say, well, it must be because you consumed fat? I mean, forgetting about the fact that all the dietary fat that comes from herbivores, right? I mean, is there something about this that appeals to a folk psychology that makes it sticky?
Well, I think the folk psychology was this idea that we get fat because we eat too much.
The thermodynamic model, right?
But this predated even the thermodynamics, and that's where the history becomes, to me, so revelatory. You realize there was no real obesity science in the 19th and early 20th century. It wasn't. I mean, there were some very smart people who wrote about it, and it turns out, if you read the German literature, which now, thanks to AI programs I can do, there was a lot of group of German investigators and European investigators who were studying mechanisms of fat formation and fat metabolism and adipose tissue and trying to determine where it came from and what made it grow. But in the obesity world, you basically had doctors saying, look, we have two types of people. We have obese people who eat a lot of food, and in that case, we can blame their obesity on gluttony. And we have people with obesity who don't eat a lot of food and don't eat any more food than lean people do, and they didn't need epidemiologic surveys with food frequency questionnaires. It's like, my aunt or my colleague down the hall. I mean, I've seen this guy eating tiny meals. He weighs 300 pounds. How do we explain them? And this one German authority, a guy named von Noorden, who is a leading authority on diabetes, writes a book saying, look, we got endogenous and exogenous obesity. Exogenous obesity is caused by eating too much. That comes from outside the body. And endogenous obesity is these people don't eat a lot of food, so their metabolism must be too slow. And now it's like you got to have more energy in than out, right? So if they're not taking a lot of energy in, they must be expanding a little. And this theory ends up sort of dominating thought for about a decade, from 1900 to 1910. And then researchers come along. I mean, throughout that period, there's one of the advances in nutrition science, metabolism science, is portable calorimeters, where you can measure energy expenditure in individuals and various ways to do it. And all these, again, mostly European researchers start using these devices to try and demonstrate that obese patients, obese individuals expend less energy than lean people. And they can't do it. And obese people are bigger than lean people. They have more protoplasm to expend energy. And so they would look, well, maybe when they're doing physical activity, they expend less. And it's no, they expend more. Maybe after meals, they expend less. No, they expend more. There was no way to demonstrate that endogenous obesity was a disease of innate failure to expend enough. So a German clinician, clinical investigator named von Bergmann, who's the son of a famous surgeon. If you like medical television, there's a great German series called La Charité about the Charité Hospital in Berlin. And the first season takes place in the 1880s with people like Koch and Virchow, and von Bergmann's father is a character in that series. Anyway, von Bergmann comes along and he does all these energy expenditure experiments. He says, look, we cannot demonstrate these people expend less energy. Maybe what they have is a constitutional disorder. He calls it lipomatosis tendency. Their fat tissue wants to take up fat. That makes sense. Like, why not? So some people have fat tissue that doesn't want to make sense. And they also point out that on our bodies, we have areas that some areas that take up fat and others don't. Like, we don't get fat on our foreheads or the back of our hands, but we do on our guts and our, there's a fat pad in our cheeks that always accumulates fat, and it's apparently there for making it easy for a baby to suckle, from the breast. It's sort of, so maybe what we're looking at is not an energy balance disorder, but some constitutional disorder of fat storage, which makes sense. And von Bergmann's theory begins to percolate through the German literature. He's joined by a Viennese, the sort of father of the School of Endocrinology and Genetics and Chronic Disease from the University of Vienna, which is one of the great universities in the world at the time, a guy named Julius Baur. And by the 1920s, they've convinced the Europeans, for the most part, that obesity is a constitutional disorder, and they're beginning to understand the science of endocrinology enough to say it's an endocrine disorder, it's a hormonal disorder, although they can't identify the hormones involved because you can't measure hormone levels in the blood. And there's researchers doing studies suggesting that it's the nervous system is involved. And they know that the hormone insulin drives fat accumulation, because you see that when you give patients with diabetes insulin, the more insulin you give, the more fat they accumulate.
But there's this other thing called glucagon, which I did not know about until I read your book. And that seems
let's
to be...
leave glucagon out, because that's, the role is more in diabetes. But anyway, the point is, 1930, this American comes along, a guy named Louis Newberg. And he gives a paper at a physicians conference in Boston. He claims that he has demonstrated experimentally that obesity is an energy balance disorder, and the fundamental disorder is gluttony. And people get fat because they eat too much.
That appeals to a certain American Puritanism, doesn't it? Right? I mean, that kind of
appeals to a certain...
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny, the Germans, the Europeans, when you look at their literature, they never even cited Newberg. It was a non-entity to them. But in the U.S., Newberg's theory caught on, and then World War II comes along and the German-Austrian theory evaporates. And the German-Austrian medical community evaporates. And the Germans and Austrians who emigrate, including some research, Julius Baur, who was by this point the leading proponent of this idea, they don't get hired by Ivy League institutions, because Ivy League institutions want nothing to do with this flood of Jewish emigres coming from Europe, unless they're physicists and can help us build atomic bombs. And so Baur ended up at this was one of the great endocrinologists of Europe. He ends up at the Hospital of Medical Evangelists in Los Angeles. And he's still publishing and he's still writing his books, but his papers just vanish. Then the German literature is no longer referenced. And again, you could I have documented all of this. So there's a the first monograph on obesity and leanness in the U.S. was published in I forget if it was 40 or 41, by a Hungarian emigre endocrinologist named Hugo Roni, who was working at Northwestern University. And roughly 50% of the references are the German language literature. All the major work is from Germany and Austria. The next textbook in 1948 is a Mayo Clinic textbook, and there's a few hundred references, maybe 500 if I'm remembering correctly. 12 are from the German literature, and 12 or 13 are from Louis Newberg. And it says, beyond a shadow of a doubt, obesity is caused by eating too much. And then by the 1960s, obesity is considered an eating disorder, a psychological defect. The field is dominated by psychologists and psychiatrists trying to figure out how to get fat people to eat less. And as time goes on,
well, that also feeds a big industry, right? That feeds a huge diet industry.
Well, it feeds, but it also, it so distorts the research community that by the time the obesity science becomes a kind of legitimate science when leptin is discovered in 1993. Because now the tools of molecular biology can be applied to leptin, and leptin is seen as a satiety hormone that's necessary to tell fat people when they should stop eating. So because the researcher who did the primary work on leptin, a guy named Jeff Friedman at Rockefeller, thought of obesity as a disorder of overeating and energy balance. That's the literature he read post-World War II. He then interpreted his discovery in that hypothesis, without being aware even by then that there was an alternative hypothesis, that obesity is a disorder of fat storage or fuel partitioning, not how much you eat, but what your body does with what you eat. And it's crazy. I mean, it's an amazing story, an amazing history. And I mean, the idea that the medical community could have made a mistake on such a profound level is, I get it, very difficult to believe.
Well, specifically with respect to diabetics, you say that a combination of pharmacological therapy and nutritional therapy is going to be superior to a reliance on just the pharmacological therapy. Now, why is that? I mean, I think most people would say, well, as long as I can get my glucose levels to where they need to be, then I'm good. But you argue that one where you don't need to take quite as much is better than one where you have to take more. So,
so let's go back. Can I make a short story long again? Go back to the 1920s. Initially, Jocelyn's thinking was, we have this very powerful drug. We don't know what the long-term effects are. We don't know. It's very dangerous to use. It's difficult to use. There are huge variations in people from day to day, from hour to hour. If we can minimize drug use, we're going to have the safest outcomes. So let's use rigid diets to minimize drug use. And he thought by that time that the rigid diet should be a very low calorie diet, but it could have been a very low carb, high fat diet. As Jocelyn just loses that argument, patients, as I said, physicians decide it's just easier than the patients like it better if they get to eat what they want, and you use higher doses of insulin. And if they get fatter because of the insulin, we can just tell them to eat less and exercise more. So that was kind of the thinking. And then by the 1930s, you see this tidal wave of complications hitting these patients. So heart disease and stroke, neuropathy, nerve damage, and lower limb amputations, and retinopathies, blindness, and kidney failure. And so these patients who had been saved from this horrible, that had been resurrected at, say, age 12, were now dying in their late 20s from the complications of what they thought was poorly controlled blood sugar, but could have been poorly controlled blood sugar. The only thing they knew is the disease itself, the insulin therapy, and the diets. Those were the things that could have been causing. It could have been that nothing they did would stop these complications. And the people arguing for liberal diets said that seems to be the case, but they were only looking out 5 or 10 years. When you got to 15, 20 years, there seemed to be evidence that better control works. So the diabetes community embraces this idea of, let's just let these people eat their carbohydrates. They'll regiment them out and, count their carbohydrates at meals so they know how much insulin they're giving, and then, that's the appropriate therapy. And it pretty much stayed that way ever since. As insulins got better, oral hypoglycemic agents come in, insulin pumps and blood sugar monitoring comes in. But the idea is always sort of craft the diet to allow for the drug therapy. And then as the drug therapy, as the complications of the disease manifest themselves, we have drugs for that. So if blood pressure goes up, we have blood pressure lowering medications. If atherosclerosis appears, we can put in stents. We have dialysis for kidney failure, and surgery, and drugs for the retinopathies and the eye problems. And the diabetes community, to their credit, does a series of very ambitious clinical trials. And the clinical trials, you could always report something positive from the trials, but for the most part, they refuted all their fundamental beliefs. So like the first time I really became aware of these studies was in 2007, when 3 trials were published that were testing the idea that intensive insulin therapy, so intensive blood sugar control, would minimize the complications of the disorder in type 2 diabetics, and they all failed. One of the trials, 2 of the trials, you had a higher level of complications, and the patients getting more insulin than less. So by the 2000s, again, another ambitious clinical trial has demonstrated that diabetes is a chronic progressive disorder. So it's always going to get worse. And the doctors are going to have to add more and more drugs and higher doses. And you're going to have complications from the drug therapy. You're going to have side effects, and those are going to have to be dealt for. So as therapy in general gets better and better every year, the medical community is embracing this idea that what we have here is a chronic progressive disorder. And I quote a 2017 ADA analysis where a leading member of the American Diabetes Association says the greatest resistance to better treatment is the greatest challenge is the resistance of physicians to adding new drugs and increasing doses.
And presumably the lifetime cost of the lifetime cost of treating a diabetic is in part contributing to the massive run up in healthcare expenditures, right, in the U.S.
Oh, and this is what, so 1 in 4 healthcare dollars is spent on diabetes therapy and its complications. It's $300 billion a year for diabetes. If you throw in diabetes and obesity, it gets close to $1 billion a year. And
trillion.
$1 billion a day, 300 million. $800 million a day for diabetes. And the cost to the patients and the insurers, it's something like, last I looked, was $16,000 or $18,000 a year in medical care on average for somebody with diabetes. So, and this is assumed to be the best we could do. New drugs will come along, and new drugs have come along, like these GLP-1 drugs like Wegovy and Ozempic, which seem to be miracle drugs for obesity, and the same way insulin was for diabetes. And because of that comparison, these new drugs make me nervous. But along the way, so by the 1990s, there's clearly an obesity and diabetes an obesity epidemic in the work, and physicians are confronted with waiting rooms with ever more obese and diabetic patients in them. And suddenly physicians start seeing patients who are looking for something that will help them, having failed on the conventional wisdom, and end up with fad diets like Atkins. And in several cases, those patients on Atkins diets had done well enough, remarkably well enough, that the physicians said we should do clinical trials on this. So Atkins was in effect the animal diet of the 19th century for diabetes, but for obesity. Fatty meat and green leafy vegetables is the easiest way. You abstain from the carbohydrate content of the diet. In diabetes, they did it because they thought these patients were carbohydrate intolerant. In obesity, people were doing it because it seemed to work. And there had been a long trail of these very low carb ketogenic diets going back to the 19th century also for obesity. So Eric Westman, who runs an obesity clinic at Duke University, has a patient who loses 40 pounds on Atkins and tells Westman, and Westman is horrified. Westman's got a medical degree from Stanford. He's a smart guy. He runs blood tests. This suddenly lean patient seems to be healthier than ever before, and he decides he's got to study this, which not everyone would. So he goes up to see Atkins and he says, give me some money and I'll run a clinical trial. And Atkins gives him some money and he runs a clinical trial, and his patients do better on Atkins than they do on any other dietary advice, particularly that being given by the American Heart Association. So not just did they lose more weight, but their heart disease risk factors improve. Mm-hmm. And it was Westman and 4 other clinical trials that had been completed by the 2002. That was what I saw when I was writing the New York Times Magazine article that got me to say, wait a minute, there's something worth reporting here. We have these 2 hypotheses. One is that high-fat diets will give you heart disease, and the other is that high-fat diets are high-calorie diets and they'll make you fatter. And yet when these 5 clinical trials put people on high-fat diets and compare them to low-fat diets, they not only lose more weight, their heart disease risk factors improve. So it seems to contradict both of these, excuse me, these ideas. So anyway, one of these trials was at Philadelphia VA Center, and the woman who did it, Linda Stern, they had all large population of obese and diabetic vets, and typically you would exclude the patients with diabetes or with what we call metabolic syndrome, pre-diabetes, from the patients if you were doing a drug trial. But for a diet trial, the Philadelphia people thought let's just include them because that's what our patients are, right? Mm-hmm. And they put these people on this Atkins diet, and they randomized them to Atkins or American Heart Association low-fat, low-calorie diet, and they also did much better, and the patients with diabetes did particularly well. So again, it starts spreading through the medical community, and you get to the point where the best trial done is actually done by a startup called Verta Health out here in San Francisco. Working in Indiana with a woman named Sarah Hallberg, who was running an obesity clinic for Indiana University. And they were basically using 21st century technology, smartphones, telemedicine, nutrition coaches to put patients with type 2 diabetes on this 19th century diet. And they randomized patients to they didn't randomize them, they let them choose. This was a flaw in the study, which they knew was a flaw, but it was the only way they could do it. They let patients choose between the Verta program, which was this 19th century diet with 21st century technology, or standard of care. You send to the diabetes specialists on campus, you get drug therapy. And anyway, I forget the exact numbers, and everybody got better on the they call nutritional ketosis, and a significant portion of the patients were able to get off all drug therapy, including insulin. So the one way to look at it is to say obesity is only a chronic progressive disorder if you're eating a carbohydrate-rich diet. But in the absence of carbohydrates, you cease to manifest symptoms of the disease, which is what a 19th century specialist would have said as well. 20th, 19th century.
Well, look, I mean, we spend trillions of dollars on healthcare, 20% of GDP, all trying to find remedies for chronic and acute diseases. And switching towards a low carb diet doesn't cost anything, right? I mean, yeah, okay, maybe certain meats might be more expensive than certain starches, but this is not an expensive intervention. And so how widespread is knowledge of this among the diabetic medical community and among the broader medical community? Because it seems to me that this whole idea of a low carb diet still is seen as something of a fad or gimmick by most medical professionals, and certainly in the general public, it seems, you walk down the grocery aisles and pretty much every product on the shelf is screaming at you that it's low fat.
True, but now there is a keto section in the grocery stores. It might not be any bigger than the section for Indian spices.
Well, it's called the butcher, right? I mean,
yeah, well, that's another way to put it. Yeah. So I think there are competing forces at work. So the internet took away the gatekeepers, so that anyone who's suffering from obesity or diabetes and is, if the conventional wisdom works for you, then you're fine, right? You eat a little less, you exercise, don't live with obesity anymore. End of story. You don't need blood sugar medications. But if you've tried the conventional wisdom, as I think most people do, and it fails, then you start looking for alternative technique. I mean, either you give up, which is possible, or you say, look, what about, Ruth down the street did Atkins and it worked for her. Let me try that. Now it's.
Well, I think a lot of people double down. Atkins. So a lot of people will go on a low fat diet, and then they just think, well, it must not be low fat enough, or I'm failing somehow, or I need to, so that it seems like people just they just they reinvest in the hypothesis.
Well, I think some people do. And again, there's no way to know. At the moment, we have no evidence, not enough evidence to know what proportion of the population I did that for 10 years. I ate in the 90s. I lived in Los Angeles. I ate a very low-fat diet. I had been recommended by a physical trainer who was the single healthiest human being I'd ever seen. And I was gaining 2 pounds a year, and I was working out every day because that's what you do in Los Angeles. And I thought this was the best I could do. Eventually, I tried Atkins because I was interviewing, while I was doing the dietary fat investigation for science, I was up at MIT interviewing the head of the laboratory for financial economics or financial engineering, something like that. And we got to talking about good science and bad science. And I was telling him about the dietary fat science. And he said, if you're writing about dietary fat, you got to try Atkins. And he said his collaborator Warden, his father lost 200 pounds on Atkins. And he's Asian American. He said he lost 40 pounds basically giving up white rice. So at the time I was single, my parents were dead, nobody would miss me except my cats if I gave myself a heart disease, and I tried Atkins, and I launched into it, eggs and bacon and fatty meat and green vegetables for lunch and dinner, and I lost 25 pounds effortlessly. It was fascinating phenomenon. So I'd been working out an hour a day with this idea that, I'm burning calories, right? That's why you worked out back then. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I didn't even have to work out. It's like I walked down the street and I lost weight. I recommend it for anyone who's interested in obesity, just to understand the phenomena. That this is not just about I'm not eating cupcakes anymore, therefore I'm getting fewer calories.
Well, now we have a new intervention, right? We have this Ozempic, and do you think this is just going to do what insulin did, in the sense that for obesity, what insulin did for diabetes, basically make it unnecessary for us to actually think too hard about our diet?
On some level, yes. That does, that's, I think, a clear implication. Again, For many people, clearly obesity is an intractable condition for many people. And I've read a lot of the fat acceptance literature for my next book. Invariably, these authors say they tried every diet and they didn't work for them, and they include Atkins. And depending on when they're written, they include the kind of eating that I would think is necessary for achieving a healthy weight, and they include diets that I think are so misguided that the proponents should be put in jail. So I believe them. I mean, the world is full of people who are just, no matter what they do, they're never going to be lean. And it's probably full of people that no matter what this is the implication of thinking of obesity as a fat storage disorder. Because if you think of it as an energy balance disorder, it's caused by eating too much. It can be reversed by eating less. Although there's all kinds of epicycles that have been put into the energy balance hypothesis to try and deal with the fact that eating less clearly doesn't work. So assuming it's a hormonal endocrine disorder and these GLP-1 agonist drugs for many people do a very good job of reversing that or overcoming it, then they're a godsend. Just like for type 1 diabetes, we're going to need insulin, and the discovery of insulin was a godsend. I worry about what happens. When I was reading about the history of type 1 diabetes, and particularly a wonderful book called Bittersweet by a University of Pennsylvania pediatrician, medical ethicist, and medical historian named Chris Feudner, the wave of complications that appeared 15, 20 years later after insulin therapy is heartbreaking. So you take this acute disease, type 1, and you turn it into a chronic disorder, and then you have the chronic complications or consequences are just terrible. And that made me scared about these GLP-1 agonists, that suddenly we'll have tens of millions of people on them for the rest of their lives. And people like to talk about them as appetite suppressant drugs because they inhibit appetite, or they slow gastric emptying, which makes them seem like they're a pharmaceutical version of a fiber-rich diet. But if people like me are right about obesity as a fat storage disorder, they are working on a much more profound physiological system, and you will not be able to predict what the long-term consequences of the drug use is. Or if you have to get off, discontinue the drug after 10 or 20 years of work. So I hope I'm wrong about all of this, because for some people, it's clearly the best thing that's ever happened. And I get it, but I worry about it.
Well, look, I mean, obesity is a growth industry. Diabetes is a growth industry globally. Even if things level off in the U.S., it seems that the rate of obesity and diabetes is going to be on the rise in a lot of the countries that are only now adopting Western diets. Is there a danger that in addition to exporting our diet, we're going to export our dietary advice? And
we have.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's already happened. So that was. There are health associations all around the world, virtually all of them, that basically just followed along on the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, and the NIH recommendations. And again, one of the, as a historian, a de facto medical historian looking into this, what's fascinating is how much those recommendations were basically based on the thinking of one or two very prominent actors who were able to drive their thinking on these disorders to the point that the health organizations accepted them. And even if they acknowledged there was a controversy, we were talking about this two competing hypotheses of obesity in 1910, 1920, 1930 in Germany. And I was recently reading a textbook chapter written by this guy von Norden, who had promoted the endogenous exogenous theory. And in it, he's talking about the competing hypothesis, this one by von Bergman and Bauer. And then he says, but we can't prove that's true. So for the time being, we should believe the original thinking. This is 1920. He has no idea that you can't say that. What he should be saying is, this might be true, but this might be true. And at the moment, we should suspend belief in all theories and do better science until we can figure it out. But you don't say believe well, I've been saying for 20 years because we can't prove that the new hypothesis is true. Anyway, you see the same kind of thing going on now with GLP-1s, with diet. It's physicians, medical doctors, public health specialists feel they have this need. I mean, they have a need to tell their patients something, to prevent disease if they think there's likely to suffer from it, or to cure disease. And if you just say, well, we have these competing hypotheses, so maybe you could eat this way, or maybe you could eat that way. Maybe you should cut down salt consumption, or maybe you should cut back on sugar consumption. We don't really know. Nobody follows your advice. So there's this pressure to be dogmatic. Do this, don't do that. We know this is right. And it makes sense on some level. You know, when we're told to buckle our seatbelts when we get into the car, nobody says, look, there's only one chance in 600 that you're going to be the person the seatbelt's life is going to save, right? You buckle that seatbelt thinking that you need it or else. I mean, I get nervous if I drive in the car without the seatbelt. It's like, and now I'm really going to have an accident, right? Because God is going to punish me for. So anyway, there's all these pressures that push doctors and public health authorities to be dogmatic. I mean, we saw the extreme case during COVID, where people who clearly had very ambiguous data were telling us what they knew for certain so that we would do it, whether it was right or wrong. And you know, it's what separates medicine from other sciences, as you pointed out. It's very much an applied science, and the application of the science perverts the way we think about that science.
Well, Gary, I think if someone writes a textbook in 100 years about public health and diabetes in the 21st century, they'll be talking about you. And so the latest book is called
I think they'll be talking about the drugs.
Yeah.
Thank
We've got this book, Rethinking Diabetes. We've got this one called Why We Get Fat, and we've got Good Calories, Bad Calories, and a whole bunch of others. Thanks so much for joining me. We'll talk again.
Thank you, Craig.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.